and welcome to episode 3 of the Expressive Watercolor series. In today's class, I'm going to be breaking down several different watercolor techniques that you have the option of including in your final project. In our last episode, you were learning how to create different pen techniques, and we'll be using those in combination with the techniques that I'm teaching you today for our final project. So I would like to just briefly describe some of the examples of techniques that you're going to be trying out today. The first is creating the grid lines, and you're using what's called a control wash, or just working on dry paper, which creates nice crisp edges, versus the wet on wet technique, where you're going to have a color in the background and you'll be dropping an additional color over the top of it to see the blurry edge effect. Next, we'll be learning how to create a gradient wash, which means going from dark to medium to light using the dip-dab technique. Next, you're going to practice a saran wrap texture and a salt texture to see the difference. And we'll also be trying out two different types of splatter/spray techniques. So the first is using just a paintbrush, and the spray technique is using a toothbrush to spray that on. And the last technique that you'll be practicing is the drip technique. And in this final section, you're practicing a couple of different color schemes that you might consider using for your final project. I'm excited to show you how to complete all of these techniques, so let's go ahead and get started. To begin this watercolor skill building activity, you first need to grab a 6x9 piece of railroad board, and you also need to grab a ruler. On the scratch piece of paper that's next to my railroad board, I'm writing down all of the measurements that you're going to mark along the side of your skill building page. And we're going to line our ruler up with the top of our railroad board so that the 0 mark is at the top of our page. And then we're going to go down and make a mark at all of those measurements that I had listed on the side. I did this step in pencil so that I could erase these marks later, and I went through and did this step on both sides of my railroad board. Next, we're going to split our paper in half by measuring out 3 inches from the left-hand side. So we're going to measure on both the top and the bottom out 3 inches. Now, before we get started painting in our division lines, I want to show you what you're going to need as far as materials. So if you open up the paintbrush box, which is located in the painting section over by the pottery wheels, you'll see all of these different paintbrushes and even a toothbrush. In that same painting section, you'll find a stack of watercolor cups that have 2 different sections. The outside is used for rinsing your brush when you have paint in it, and then the inside cell will remain clear with clean water. Next, you're going to need a piece of paper towel for yourself while you're painting. Each student should have their own, and I like to set it underneath my watercolor cup while I'm working. Depending on what paint we have available for the year that you are working on this project, we may be working with different types of watercolor. The first comes in this plastic tray, and it is still a high quality. These aren't just Crayola, and they work really well. They have a lot of different color options. The next possibility is working with watercolor that comes from a tube. So these are a little bit higher quality, but maybe sometimes a little bit more difficult to work with because they start to get a little loose in the bottom of those ice cube trays. So you can see that they do kind of move around a little bit. And the third option is working with liquid watercolor paint. And as you can see, these come in bottles. You have to squirt out the amount that you need into these trays, which are actually vitamin containers for horses. So those are our 3 options of watercolor paint that you might be using for this project. For this example, I'm going to work with the watercolor sets that come in those plastic trays, just because they're the most basic ones to work with, and it's usually what we have the most access to. The first step for this skill building activity is to create the division lines between our sections that we're going to be working with. Now, the reason why we're doing this in watercolor is so that you can practice the difference of working on dry paper while creating lines versus what happens when you work on wet paper. So we're going to get our brush wet and we're going to use some of that water to mix an even, consistent puddle of paint that we're going to use, and you can choose any color. I do want you to use a ruler when you're working so that you can have it next to you. You don't have to paint all the way up against the edge, but just having it there will help you make a straighter line. For this center division line, I'd like for you to work with a brush that is a flat brush where you can control the thickness of your line. Notice that I had to reload the paint onto my brush a couple of different times because my color started to fade out. So what I'm looking for with these division lines is that your center line is thicker, that you have a consistent color all the way through, and that your edges are nice and sharp. Notice that I got some paint on my ruler and I had to wipe that off on my paper towel. I also needed to raise my ruler up a little bit when working on my next lines. So notice that I'm holding my brush at a sideways angle to make those lines just a little bit thinner than what I created for my center line. And I'm holding that ruler up so that it's not resting in that puddle of watercolor that I painted in my center line. It's okay if these lines are not perfectly straight, we just want them to be evenly measured, which you should have already taken care of with the measurements on the side of my paper. So we're creating different sections with title areas directly above them, and the first 3 sections are going to be the same thickness, and that 4th section is going to be a little bit thicker than the rest that we are creating. Part of creating this watercolor skill building involves working around wet watercolor paint and not smearing or smudging or having these sections fade or blend together. So I would like for you to continue on even though your lines are going to be wet, and we just have to raise our hand up a little bit while we fill in the following titles. The first will be a wet on wet. Second, we're going to do gradient. Third, we're going to do a saran wrap practice. Fourth, we're going to add salt. Fifth, we're going to do a splatter. Sixth, we're going to do a spray. Seventh, we're going to do a drip. And eighth, for our final practice, you are going to write color practice, which is where you're planning out potential color schemes. As we're working through these techniques, it does not matter if you use the same colors that I use for my skill building, but I do want you to follow along with what I'm doing as far as the technique goes. For this first one, you're going to choose a lighter color and you're going to fill in a rectangle that goes almost to the outside edges, but remember that your lines are probably still wet at this point, and we don't want our outside outline color to fade into our wet on wet technique. So we want to leave some separation there. While our first color is still wet, we're going to select a darker color and we're going to add little drops of that into this section, and we're going to notice how those edges are very soft and very blurry. Sometimes it takes a little bit of water. You need to add some more water into your section to make this effect happen. So if you have solid edges, that might mean that your background didn't have quite enough water to it yet. It also does take a little bit of time sometimes for those edges to spread out into the area surrounding it. Notice that I'm only rinsing my brush off in the outside ring of my cup if I have a color in it, and I'm saving that center area of my cup for clean water so that when I get a new color, I'll have that clean water to work with rather than mixing all of my colors on accident. Next, I'm going to get started on my gradient, which includes a specific pattern. So I filled my brush with a color, made sure that it was nice and solid and mixed really well before I painted it on. Then I dipped my brush into my water and dabbed on my paper towel and did a couple more strokes. Then I dipped in my water, dabbed on my paper towel, and did a couple of more strokes. So that pattern of dipping in the water, dabbing on your paper towel, and adding strokes is slowly removing the paint from your paintbrush. Our goal here is to help it fade from dark to medium to light, so you should have a nice smooth transition with our gradient. Next, we're going to complete our saran wrap practice. So we're going to fill in our patch in that box, and again, making sure that we are not overlapping into the border lines that we created, although they probably are starting to dry at this point. While we're working on our saran wrap practice, we want to make sure that we're incorporating a couple of different colors and that we have enough liquid on our paper to make the effect actually work. Because if you try to place saran wrap over the top of an area that's pretty dry or doesn't have a whole lot of liquid on it, it will not do anything to change the texture. So we have to make sure that we've got at least like a little puddle off to the bottom or the side when we're working on this. Now you want your piece of saran wrap to be about the same size as the piece that you're covering, so it should just be a very small little section of saran wrap, and you're going to place it down over the top of your section that you just painted. And notice that I'm trying to kind of bunch it together so that there are some abrupt edges and angles before I move on. Next, I'm going to create my salt technique practice, and for this we're just going to fill in a section of any color of your choice. So I'm going to just paint in our rectangle like we have been. Notice that I'm still really paying attention to using the outside ring when my brush is dirty and the inside ring when I'm getting a new color. So I'm painting this box, and we want to again make sure that we have enough liquid in our section to make this effect actually work, because if you put salt on top of an area that's already pretty much dry, it again will not do anything. So we have to make sure that we complete these steps while our paint is still very wet. I took my salt shaker and poured just a small amount into my hand, and then I used my fingers to just pinch a small amount and just sprinkled it over the top of that section so that I could see the effect that the salt has on the watercolor once it dries. This next practice can get a little bit messy, so feel free to take a piece of printer paper or even a paper towel to place over the rest of your skill building activity. Although I did not do that in my example, I think I probably would have benefited from it because I got my splatters everywhere. But you're going to take a large amount of water and mix it with your color so that it's liquidy enough to make this a successful practice. And you're going to rest your hand on top of the table and hold out your pointer finger so that you can tap your brush gently against it. What you want to avoid with this is arching your paintbrush backwards when it's loaded with liquid, because it'll actually fling it the opposite direction as well as forward. So you want to make sure that you're not getting it on yourself and your clothes. To get the larger splatters, I incorporated more liquid, so sometimes I would even dip my brush into my paint and then dip it into the water cup so that I would have larger splatters in addition to my smaller splatters. So with this practice, you want to try to play around with having both small and large splatters. For our next technique practice, you're going to take your paintbrush, load a large amount of water into your paint and mix it together so it's nice and consistent, and you're going to take that puddle of paint and paint on top of the toothbrush that was provided in your paint box. You want to include quite a bit of this paint onto your brush, or else it will be very, very faint when you try to spray it onto your paper. Next, you're just going to take your thumb and brush over the top of it, kind of move it around so you can get that spray effect. The last technique that we're going to practice is the drip. So we're going to take quite a large amount of water to mix in with a new color for us to practice with. And we're going to mix that paint with the water to make sure it's nice and consistent and not just clear water that's over the top of our watercolor paint. So we're mixing them together to make sure it's consistent, and we're going to begin by creating just a solid line of watercolor up near the top of the section that's at the bottom of our page. Notice that I'm going to add quite a large amount of water and another color to the bottom of that line, and you can even start to begin some of your drips so that they are more intentionally spaced. Then I'm just going to tip my page up so that the drips flow down to the bottom of my paper, and I can just play around with adding some more water to the spaces that didn't drip as much as I wanted them to. You can also try tapping the side of your paper, but I noticed that that gave me some weird angles, which can be cool, but if you're not planning on making angles, I would recommend just tapping it straight up and down and adding more water. For the final portion of this skill building activity, you have to know a couple of different color schemes. So to break this down for you, the first would be analogous that you could use as an option, and that just means that you're choosing colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So you can choose between 3 to 5-ish colors that are all next to each other, and this is an example of using warm colors like reds, orange, and yellows together, cool colors with blues, greens, and violets together, or with analogous, you can also do a combination of those colors. So if you wanted to do oranges, yellows, and greens, that would be a mixture of warm and cool, but it would count because they are all next to each other, which makes them analogous. A second option would be to work with complementary colors, which means that they are colors that are directly across from each other on the color wheel. And to make this more interesting for this project, you could include some variations of those colors, which might also be known as split complementary. So you can use variations of those colors that are across from each other. Now, with this example, you need to be very careful not to mix these colors and blend them together too much in your final project, unless you're planning on getting more of like a neutral tone, so closer to like browns or grays, because when you mix complementary colors together, you get what's called a neutral. The final example I'll give you of a color scheme is using the triadic color scheme, which means that you're working with 3 colors that are evenly spaced from each other. So an example that you probably would recognize is the primary color scheme using red, yellow, and blue together, or the secondary color scheme using violet, orange, and green together. So having these colors evenly spaced is what makes it a triadic color scheme. Now keep in mind that these are just some of the examples I provided for you, but if you research online different color scheme options, it'll give you tons and tons of possibilities that you can use for this section of your project. When you're completing the color practice section, the final portion of your watercolor skill building, you need to come up with 4 different options for color schemes for your project. So for this first example, I used orange, like fading yellow, and then variations of blue. So this could be either complementary or a split complementary, just because I used those variations. A second color scheme that I was trying to practice was analogous. So I was doing a combination of warm and cool colors, but because they are next to each other, they work as an analogous color scheme. So I chose to practice orange, yellow, yellow-green, and then green because they are all next to each other on the color wheel. The next color scheme that I included for this practice section was incorporating warm colors. So I laid out red, orange, and yellow, knowing that I could do variations of those colors as well. For my fourth and final color scheme that I practiced in this section, I did another version of analogous colors. So I included orange, red, red-violet, and then a purple. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode. I hope it was helpful to see all of these techniques broken down into very easy to follow steps, and I am looking forward to our next episode together. Thanks for watching.